The summer carnival had returned to the quiet town of Brooksville, much to the delight of its residents. Children dragged their parents to the rides, teenagers gathered in groups to enjoy the attractions, and the smell of fried food filled the air. Among the myriad of rides, one stood out: the Nightcrawler, a new roller coaster that promised the ultimate thrill. Mark, Sarah, and their friends Mike and Jenny were drawn to it immediately. They were adrenaline junkies, always seeking the next big rush. The Nightcrawler's towering loops and steep drops were irresistible. They approached the ride, noticing the odd way the structure seemed to blend into the night, its dark steel tracks almost invisible against the sky. As they waited in line, they overheard whispers from other carnival goers. "I heard it's cursed," one person said. "They say it was built on the site of an old graveyard," another added. Mark brushed it off with a laugh. "Just rumors to scare us," he said, though he couldn't shake a growing unease. Their turn came, and they strapped into the sleek black cars. The ride operator, a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes, gave them a slow, unsettling smile. "Enjoy the ride," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The cars lurched forward, climbing the first hill. As they reached the peak, the town spread out below them, bathed in the soft glow of carnival lights. Then, the drop. Their stomachs flipped as they plummeted down the track. Twists, turns, and loops came in rapid succession, each more intense than the last. But as they raced through the ride, strange things began to happen. The temperature dropped sharply, and an unnatural fog enveloped the track. Mark glanced at Sarah, her face pale with fear, not excitement. The coaster plunged into a tunnel, and everything went dark. In the pitch black, they could hear whispers, unintelligible but filled with malice. Mark felt something cold brush against his arm like a hand. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. Then, without warning, they emerged from the tunnel, the lights of the carnival blinding in their intensity. They breathed a collective sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. The track ahead was different, twisting in impossible angles. The ride became rougher, more violent. Jenny screamed as the car seemed to lift off the track, only to slam back down. Mark tried to hold on, but his grip was slipping. Suddenly, they found themselves at the top of a hill, looking down into what seemed like a bottomless pit. The car hesitated, then plunged downward. The sensation was unlike any freefall they had experienced. It felt endless, as if they were falling through layers of reality. The whispers returned, louder and clearer now. "Join us," they said. "Stay with us forever." They landed with a jolt, the car skidding to a stop. They were back at the loading platform, but something was wrong. The carnival lights were dim, and the once cheerful music played at a distorted, sinister pitch. The ride operator was gone, replaced by a shadowy figure with hollow eyes. The friends stumbled out, shaken and disoriented. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. They made their way to the exit, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The carnival around them had changed. The vibrant colors were now muted and dull, and the faces of the people were twisted with fear and pain. They finally reached the edge of the carnival, only to find it surrounded by an impenetrable wall of fog. They were trapped. The whispers followed them, growing louder. "Stay with us," they urged. Mark realized with horror that the Nightcrawler had not just been a ride. It was a gateway. They had crossed into another realm, one where the carnival was a prison, and they were its latest captives. Desperation set in as they tried to find a way out, but every path led them back to the Nightcrawler. The ride stood ominously, its entrance beckoning them to ride again. "We have to try," Mike said, though his voice wavered with fear. They climbed back into the cars, hoping that another ride would return them to their world. The coaster jerked forward, and they braced themselves. As they sped through the ride, the whispers became screams, and the shadows reached out with the grasping hands. The ride was longer this time, the darkness more oppressive. They clung to each other, fighting to stay together. Emerging from the final tunnel, they found themselves back at the platform. The ride operator, or what looked like him, stood waiting. "Welcome back," he said, his smile revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Your journey has just begun." Realization dawned on Mark. They were not escaping. They were part of the carnival now, forever doomed to ride the Nightcrawler, trapped in an endless loop of terror. The carnival fed on their fear, growing stronger with each scream, and so the carnival remained, a beacon of joy and thrills by day, but a nightmare by night. The Nightcrawler stood as its dark heart, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to take their last ride. Weeks later, new visitors arrived at the carnival, drawn by the allure of the Nightcrawler. They heard the same whispers of curses and haunted grounds, but like Mark and his friends, they shrugged them off as mere stories. As they strapped in and the ride began, the sun set, casting long shadows over the carnival. The Nightcrawler roared to life, ready to claim its next victims, and the whispers began anew, promising an unforgettable ride. The carnival thrived, its sinister secret hidden behind the laughter and lights, and somewhere within, Mark, Sarah, Mike, and Jenny rode the Nightcrawler, their screams echoing through the night, part of the carnival's eternal show. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie twilight over the small town of Crescent Valley. Every summer, the residents eagerly awaited the arrival of the traveling carnival, a tradition that had persisted for decades. The air would buzz with excitement as rides were erected, tents were pitched, and the smell of cotton candy and popcorn wafted through the streets. This year, however, something felt different. Emily and her friends, Jake, Lisa, and Tom, were thrilled. They had just graduated high school, and this would be their last summer together before heading off to different colleges. The carnival seemed like the perfect way to celebrate. As they approached the entrance, they noticed a new attraction, the Carnival of Shadows. "Looks creepy," Jake said, eyeing the black and crimson tent with curiosity. A sign above the entrance read, "Enter if you dare, no refunds." "Let's check it out," Emily suggested, her adventurous spirit shining through. They bought their tickets and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with only flickering lanterns casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Strange, distorted music played softly in the background, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The first room they entered was filled with funhouse mirrors. At first they laughed at their distorted reflections, but soon the laughter turned to confusion. The reflections began to change, not just in shape, but in behavior. Emily's reflection grinned malevolently and started to move independently. Jake's reflection stared back with hollow eyes, and Lisa's reflection seemed to whisper silently to her. Tom, who had wandered off, suddenly screamed. The group rushed to find him staring at a mirror that showed not his reflection, but a scene of him lying lifeless on the ground, surrounded by shadows. "We need to get out of here," Tom stammered, pale with fear. They hurried into the next room, a maze of dark corridors. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to pulse and breathe. Faint whispers echoed around them, speaking in languages they couldn't understand. As they navigated the maze, they realized they were not alone. Shadowy figures flitted just out of sight, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. Panic set in as they tried to find their way out. Every turn led them deeper into the maze. The shadows grew bolder, sometimes brushing against them with a chill that seeped into their bones. At one point, Lisa felt a cold hand grip her ankle, causing her to trip and fall. When she looked up, a shadowy face loomed inches from hers, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Finally, they burst into a large central chamber, hoping it was the exit. Instead, they found a sinister ringmaster standing in the center, dressed in a tattered top hat and coat, his eyes glowing red. "Welcome, my guests," he purred. "You've made it to the heart of the Carnival of Shadows." "Let us out," Jake demanded, his voice trembling. The ringmaster chuckled. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, The carnival feeds on fear, and you have provided a feast. But don't worry, you will become part of the show forever." With a wave of his hand, the shadows closed in. Emily felt an overwhelming coldness, and her vision blurred. The last thing she saw was the ringmaster's cruel smile as darkness engulfed her. When she awoke, she found herself in another mirror maze, but this time she was alone. The reflections were gone, replaced by darkness. She wandered through the maze, calling out for her friends, but the only response was the echo of her own voice. Hours, or perhaps days, passed. Emily couldn't tell. Time seemed to have no meaning in the carnival. She stumbled upon a mirror that showed a glimpse of the outside world. People were laughing, enjoying the rides, completely unaware of the horrors within the carnival of shadows. Desperate, she pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but no one could hear her. The mirror shattered, and the ringmaster's voice echoed through the void. "Welcome to the Carnival of Shadows, Emily. Enjoy your stay." Outside, the carnival continued its cheerful facade, oblivious to the fate of those trapped within. The black and crimson tent stood as a silent sentinel, waiting for the next group of curious souls to enter, lured by the promise of thrills and chills, never knowing that they would never return. And so, the Carnival of Shadows continued to travel from town to town, feeding on the fear of the unwary, growing stronger with each victim. Emily, Jake, Lisa, and Tom became part of its eternal show, their screams of terror adding to the sinister symphony that played endlessly within the cursed tent. Every summer, the quaint town of Willowbrook was transformed by the arrival of the Brightwood Carnival. Known for its spectacular performances and vibrant atmosphere, the carnival was a highlight for residents young and old. This year, a new attraction promised to dazzle and mystify: the Marionettes Dance. Alex, Maria, Ethan, and Chloe were excited. The four friends had been attending the carnival together since they were kids, and they were eager to see what the new attraction had to offer. The marquee outside the tent was adorned with ornate, old-fashioned designs, and the entrance was flanked by life-sized marionettes, their painted faces frozen in eerie, welcoming smiles. Inside, the tent was dimly lit, with rows of seats facing a small stage. They took their seats, the air buzzing with anticipation. The lights dimmed further, and a hush fell over the crowd as the show began. A single spotlight illuminated the stage, revealing an old man dressed in a tattered suit, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a worn top hat. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen," he croaked. "Tonight, you will witness the enchanting performance of the Marionettes Dance, a spectacle of wonder, a marvel of magic." With a flourish, he pulled back a curtain to reveal a dozen marionettes hanging from the ceiling. The strings glistened in the low light, and the wooden figures, dressed in elaborate costumes, seemed almost lifelike. The old man began to play a haunting melody on a violin, and the marionettes sprang to life, their movements perfectly synchronized with the music. The audience watched in awe as the marionettes performed intricate dances, their limbs moving with an unsettling grace. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. There was something disturbingly human about their movements. Maria nudged him, her eyes wide with excitement. "This is amazing," she whispered. As the performance continued, the atmosphere grew darker. The music became more discordant, and the marionettes' movements more frantic. The old man's playing was almost feverish, and his eyes, now visible, glowed with an unnatural light. The audience was entranced, unable to look away. Suddenly, the music stopped, and the marionettes froze. The old man stepped forward, his voice low and sinister. "But the true magic of the Marionettes Dance," he said, "is yet to come." With a snap of his fingers, the marionettes began to move again, but this time they were not performing a dance. Instead, they moved towards the audience, their wooden faces twisted into expressions of malevolence. The audience gasped as the marionettes descended from the stage, their strings stretching impossibly long. Alex and his friends watched in horror as the marionettes approached. The old man laughed, a sound that sent shivers through the tent. "You see," he said, "my marionettes need new souls to dance." Before they could react, the marionettes were upon them. One grabbed Alex's arm with surprising strength, its wooden fingers digging into his flesh. He tried to pull away, but the grip was unyielding. He looked at Maria, who was struggling against another marionette. Ethan and Chloe were similarly trapped. The old man raised his violin and began to play again, the haunting melody filling the tent. The marionettes started to dance, dragging their victims with them. Alex felt his body move against his will, his limbs jerking in time with the music. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. As the dance continued, Alex felt a strange sensation wash over him. His movements became smoother, more fluid, but he also felt a cold, wooden rigidity creeping through his body. He looked down in horror as his skin began to harden and crack, transforming into polished wood. The old man's eyes gleamed as he watched the transformation. "You are becoming one with the marionette's dance," he said, his voice filled with dark satisfaction. "Soon you will join my collection, and the dance will continue." Desperation and fear surged through Alex, but it was too late. The transformation was complete. He could no longer feel his body. He was a marionette, suspended by invisible strings, his soul trapped within the wooden shell. He could see and hear everything, but he was powerless to move of his own accord. The old man lowered his violin and the music stopped. The new marionettes, including Alex, Maria, Ethan, and Chloe, stood motionless on the stage. The old man bowed to the audience, who were now all marionettes themselves, trapped in the same fate. "Thank you for attending the marionettes dance," he said, his voice echoing through the silent tent. "The show will continue, as it always has, with new performers and new souls." The lights dimmed and the old man disappeared behind the curtain. The tent was plunged into darkness, but for Alex and his friends, the nightmare was far from over. They were part of the show now, forever bound to the marionettes' dance, their souls imprisoned in wooden bodies, doomed to perform for eternity. As the carnival moved to a new town, the tent of the marionettes' dance stood as a silent sentinel, waiting for new visitors. The old man, with his violin and his collection of marionettes, would perform the same sinister show, ensnaring new souls with each performance. And so the legend of the marionette's curse continued, a dark secret hidden behind the bright lights and joyful laughter of the Brightwood Carnival. Each summer, unsuspecting souls would be drawn to the enchanting performance, never realizing that they would become part of the eternal dance, their cries for help unheard, their pleas for mercy ignored, as the show went on and on.
Emily had always loved photography. Ever since she received her first camera as a child, she had been fascinated by capturing moments in time. Now, as a college student majoring in photography, she spent most of her free time exploring abandoned places, looking for the perfect shot. One afternoon, Emily was browsing through a dusty old thrift store when she came across an antique camera. It was a beautiful, ornate piece, with intricate designs etched into the metal casing. The shop owner, an elderly man with a knowing look in his eyes, offered it to her for a suspiciously low price. "Be careful with that one," he warned. "It has a history." Emily laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to add to the allure. She bought the camera and headed home, eager to try it out. That night, Emily decided to test the camera in her apartment. She set up some candles and arranged a few objects to create an eerie, atmospheric scene. As she looked through the viewfinder, she noticed something strange. In the reflection of the mirror she was photographing, she saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. Startled, Emily turned around, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off as a trick of the light and continued taking pictures. After developing the film in her makeshift darkroom, she noticed something even more unsettling. The shadowy figure appeared in every single photo, growing closer and more defined with each shot. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Emily decided to take the camera to one of her favorite abandoned locations, the old Fairview Asylum. The asylum had been closed for decades, and local legends spoke of restless spirits and eerie happenings. Emily arrived at the asylum just before sunset. The decaying building loomed against the darkening sky, its windows broken and its walls covered in ivy. She felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of mold and decay. She began exploring the asylum, snapping photos of the crumbling walls and forgotten rooms. Every now and then she felt a cold breeze brush past her, even though the air was still. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she ventured deeper into the building, she came across a room that seemed untouched by time. The walls were lined with old photographs, each one depicting patients of the asylum. In the center of the room stood a large mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Emily approached the mirror, wiping away the dust with her sleeve. As she looked into it, she saw the shadowy figure again, standing right behind her. This time, it was clearer than ever before. A tall, dark shape with glowing eyes. Panic surged through her as she turned around, but the room was empty. She raised the camera and snapped a photo of the mirror, hoping to capture whatever was haunting her. The flash illuminated the room for a brief moment, revealing the figure standing in the corner. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her hands shaking. She knew she had to leave, but something compelled her to stay. She continued taking pictures, each flash revealing more of the sinister presence around her. Finally, she reached the end of the hallway where a locked door stood. Desperate for answers, she tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She raised the camera one last time and took a photo of the door. The flash revealed a horrifying scene. The room beyond was filled with shadowy figures, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Emily stumbled back, dropping the camera. She turned to run, but the figures were closing in on her, their whispers filling her ears. She felt a cold hand grasp her shoulder, and everything went black. When Emily woke up, she was lying on the floor of the asylum, the camera shattered beside her. She scrambled to her feet and ran out of the building, not stopping until she reached her car. She drove home, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Back in her apartment, she tried to piece together what had happened. She developed the remaining film from the camera, her hands trembling. The photos revealed the full extent of the horror she had witnessed. Dozens of shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with malevolence. Emily knew she had to get rid of the camera. She packed it up and returned to the thrift store, but the shop was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. She realized the shop owner had never intended for her to return. Desperate, she drove to the nearest river and hurled the camera into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. She hoped that would be the end of it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching her. Months passed, and Emily tried to move on with her life. But every time she looked through her new camera, she saw glimpses of the shadowy figures lurking in the background. She realized that the curse wasn't tied to the camera, it was tied to her. Emily had unknowingly become the subject of the very horror she sought to capture. No matter where she went, the shadows followed. And as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, she knew she could never escape the darkness that had claimed her.
Jake was an avid collector of rare and unusual antiques. His small apartment was filled with oddities from all over the world, each piece with its own story, its own history. But despite his impressive collection, he was always on the lookout for something truly unique, something that would stand out among the rest. One rainy afternoon, Jake found himself wandering through the winding alleys of a city he'd never visited before. The rain drizzled down, making the cobblestones slick and reflecting the dim light from the street lamps. As he turned a corner, he noticed a small, unassuming shop nestled between two larger buildings. Its wooden sign, barely readable through the grime, read, "Curiosities and Relics." Intrigued, Jake pushed open the creaky door, a small bell jingling as he stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit. the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with all sorts of strange and fascinating objects, ancient books, tarnished jewelry, and statues from distant lands. But what caught Jake's eye was a large, ornate mirror leaning against the back wall. It was framed in dark, intricately carved wood that seemed to writhe and twist like a mass of serpents. The glass itself was slightly clouded, as though it had been untouched for centuries. But the most striking feature was the faint, almost imperceptible glow emanating from its surface. As Jake approached the mirror, he felt a strange pull, as if the mirror was calling to him. He could have sworn he saw something move within the glass, but when he looked closer, it was just his own reflection staring back at him. An elderly woman emerged from the shadows of the shop, her eyes sharp and knowing. "That mirror has a long and dark history," she said in a voice that was both soft and commanding. "It's said to be cursed, to trap the souls of those who become too obsessed with their own reflection." Jake, ever the skeptic, dismissed her warning with a smile. "I'll take it," he said, not thinking twice about the ominous tone in her voice. The woman hesitated, but then nodded, accepting his payment with a look that seemed to say she was glad to be rid of the mirror. That night, Jake brought the mirror home and placed it in his bedroom, hanging it on the wall opposite his bed. As he lay down to sleep, he found his eyes drawn to it, the faint glow casting an eerie light across the room. He could feel the mirror's presence, almost as if it was watching him. Over the next few days, Jake began to notice strange things happening in his apartment. He would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, but when he turned to look, nothing was there. Objects seemed to shift positions on their own, and at night, he heard soft whispers that seemed to come from the direction of the mirror. One evening, as Jake was getting ready for bed, he stood in front of the mirror, running a hand through his hair. He froze when he noticed something odd. His reflection didn't mimic his movements. Instead, it stared back at him with a cold, empty expression. Jake stepped back in shock, his heart pounding, but the reflection remained motionless, its eyes fixed on him. Panicked, Jake turned away, but the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. He spun back to face the mirror, only to see his reflection smiling, a twisted, malevolent grin that sent chills down his spine. Suddenly, the glass rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone, and Jake felt a cold hand grip his wrist, pulling him toward the mirror. He struggled, but the grip was too strong. The whispers became deafening, and as Jake was pulled closer, he saw other faces in the mirror, pale, ghostly faces with hollow eyes and twisted expressions. They were trapped, their souls imprisoned within the glass, and they were calling to him, begging him to join them. With one last desperate effort, Jake broke free, stumbling back onto the floor. The room was cold, the light dimmed, and the mirror's glow pulsed with a sinister energy. Jake knew he had to get rid of it. The next morning, Jake wrapped the mirror in a thick blanket and drove to the outskirts of town, where he found an isolated field. He dug a deep hole and buried the mirror, hoping that would be the end of it. But the nightmares began that night. Jake dreamt of the mirror, its surface no longer clouded but clear as crystal, showing him visions of the lost souls trapped inside. He saw their lives, their torment, and their desperate attempts to escape. And each night, the dreams became more vivid, more terrifying, as if the mirror was reaching out to him even from beneath the earth. Jake's health began to deteriorate. He became paranoid, seeing the faces from the mirror in every reflective surface, in windows, in puddles, even in the glint of a spoon. The voices returned, whispering to him in the dead of night, urging him to dig up the mirror and free them. Unable to take it any longer, Jake returned to the field. He dug frantically, his hands blistered and bleeding, until he uncovered the mirror. It was no longer wrapped in the blanket but was clean, its surface shimmering under the moonlight. With trembling hands, Jake lifted the mirror, staring into its depths. The faces were there, clearer than ever, their eyes pleading. And there in the center was his own reflection, grinning that same twisted grin he had seen before. The cold hand reached out from the glass again, but this time Jake didn't resist. He felt himself being pulled into the mirror, the world around him fading as he was drawn into the cold, dark void. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the sound of his own voice, whispering from the mirror's surface, now one of the many lost souls trapped within. The next day, Jake's apartment was eerily quiet. His friends, worried after not hearing from him for days, came to check on him. They found the place empty, with no sign of Jake or the mirror. Only a single ominous message was left scrawled on the wall in a shaky hand. "Beware the mirror of lost souls." And from that day forward, anyone who entered Jake's apartment felt a strange presence, as if they were being watched. Some claimed to hear whispers coming from the walls, others saw fleeting reflections of faces that weren't their own. But the mirror and Jake were never seen again. Lena had always been drawn to music. Ever since she was a child, the sound of a beautiful melody could transport her to another world. Now, as a young woman living alone in a small, quiet town, she often found solace in her piano, playing haunting tunes late into the night. One chilly autumn afternoon, Lena decided to visit the local flea market, a sprawling maze of stalls filled with all sorts of curiosities. As she wandered through the narrow aisles, her eyes were drawn to a small, intricately carved wooden box resting on a cluttered table. The box was about the size of her hand, with delicate floral designs etched into the dark wood and a small winding key on the side. The vendor, an elderly woman with a kind smile and deep-set knowing eyes, noticed Lena's interest. "Ah, the music box," she said, her voice soft yet filled with a certain weight. "It's a rare find. Some say it's enchanted." Lena chuckled, but the woman continued, her expression serious. "The melodies it plays are beautiful, but beware. Once you start listening, it's hard to stop." Intrigued, Lena bought the music box and brought it home. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she placed the box on her piano and carefully wound the key. The box sprang to life, playing a hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed to fill the entire room with a strange, ethereal warmth. Lena was entranced. The music was unlike anything she had ever heard before, melancholic yet soothing, as if it was telling a story of love and loss. She couldn't help but listen, her fingers tracing the delicate carvings on the box as the melody played on. Over the next few days, Lena found herself becoming obsessed with the music box. She would wind it up at every opportunity, letting the haunting tune fill her apartment. But as time went on, she began to notice something strange. The melody seemed to change subtly with each play, growing darker, more ominous, and with the changes came disturbing visions. One night, as Lena sat in the dimly lit room, listening to the music box, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. Startled, she looked up, but there was nothing there. Shaking it off, she wound the box again, and as the melody began to play, the shadows in the room seemed to dance to the rhythm of the music. Lena's heart pounded as she watched the shadows take on distinct shapes, figures of people, twisted and ghostly, their movements slow and deliberate. The air grew cold, and the once soothing melody now felt oppressive, as if it was binding her to the spot. Terrified, Lena tried to stop the music, but the box continued to play, the figures growing more defined, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and sorrow. They reached out to her, their shadowy hands stretching across the room, and she felt an icy grip tighten around her heart. In a panic, Lena grabbed the music box and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, and the music stopped abruptly, the shadows dissolving into the darkness. Breathing heavily, Lena stared at the shattered remains of the box, relief washing over her. But the silence was short-lived. From the broken pieces of the box, a soft, mournful melody began to play, the sound faint but unmistakable. Lena felt a chill run down her spine as the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. The room seemed to darken around her, and she realized with growing horror that the music box was not just an object. It was a portal, a conduit for something far more sinister. The shadows returned, more menacing than before, and this time, they didn't just reach out to her. They began to close in, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Lena backed away, her heart racing, but there was nowhere to run. The room was filled with the oppressive presence of the figures, their sorrowful cries mingling with the haunting melody. Desperate to escape, Lena ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows inching closer with every passing second. She could feel the coldness of their touch, their sadness seeping into her very soul. As the music reached its crescendo, Lena felt her strength leave her. She collapsed to the floor, her vision blurring as the shadows surrounded her, their whispers filling her ears. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the shattered music box, the melody playing on, relentless and unforgiving. The next morning, Lena's neighbors found her apartment eerily quiet. The door was unlocked, and inside, they found her lying on the floor, her face pale and lifeless. The music box was gone, leaving no trace of its existence, save for a lingering melody that seemed to echo faintly through the empty room, a melody that spoke of sorrow, loss, and an ancient curse that had claimed yet another soul.
It was supposed to be a simple road trip. I had been driving through rural Pennsylvania on my way to visit an old friend. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden light over the open fields. I had my music on, the windows down, and nothing but miles of road ahead of me. I was on a detour. Some roadwork had blocked the highway, so my GPS was recalculating, suggesting a shortcut through back roads. I didn't think much of it. I liked taking the scenic route anyway, but after an hour, the road narrowed and the fields gave way to thick woods. The GPS signal dropped, and before I realized it, I was driving deeper into nowhere, surrounded by trees on all sides. The asphalt turned to gravel, then dirt, and finally, it felt like I was driving on nothing but roots and rocks. I tried to turn back, but there wasn't a good place to make a U-turn. The light was fading fast, and my unease grew with each passing minute. I pressed forward, hoping the road would lead to a town, or at least another highway. That's when I saw it. A small clearing up ahead. In the middle of it, an old barn with peeling red paint. Next to it, an old farmhouse, the kind you'd expect to be abandoned. But there was a single light on in one of the windows. I debated with myself. Should I stop and ask for directions, or just keep driving and hope to find a main road? Something told me to keep going, but curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of me. I pulled over, cut the engine, and got out of the car. The evening air was heavy and still, not even the sound of insects. As I approached the house, I noticed a truck parked out front, rusted, with its tires half sunken into the earth. It didn't look like it had moved in years, but the light was still on. I knocked on the door, hoping for some friendly local who could point me back to civilization. The door creaked open a few inches, and a man stepped out, tall and broad, wearing dirty overalls and a worn baseball cap. His eyes were narrow, and his mouth pulled into a tight line. He looked me over like he was sizing me up. "Lost?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah, my GPS cut out and I'm trying to get back to the highway," I explained, forcing a smile to hide my nervousness. "Think you could give me directions?" He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his hand gripping the doorframe. After what felt like forever, he nodded slowly. "Sure, come on inside. We can get you a map." Something about the way he said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I should have just thanked him and left, but instead, I followed him inside. The house smelled musty, like damp wood and stale air. It was dark, the only light coming from an old lamp in the corner. The furniture was worn, and the walls were lined with hunting trophies, deer heads, antlers, and even a few stuffed birds. As I stepped further into the room, I noticed movement from the shadows. More people. 3 men and 1 woman sat around a wooden table, staring at me with blank expressions. They looked rough, like they'd been living hard lives in isolation. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind that made you feel like you were a deer that had wandered into a lion's den. "You lost?" one of the men asked, echoing the words of the first guy. "Yeah, just looking for the highway," I said, my voice feeling too loud in the quiet room. The first man, the one who had opened the door, stood behind me now, and I felt boxed in. I glanced at the door, considering my options, but the way they were all looking at me made it clear that leaving wasn't going to be easy. "You're a long way from the highway," the woman said, still smiling. "Why don't you sit down, have a drink? We don't get many visitors around here." I shook my head. "Thanks, but I really should get back on the road before it gets too dark." The man behind me placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, his fingers digging in just enough to make me understand that I wasn't leaving yet. "Stay a while," he said softly, but there was nothing gentle about the way he said it. "It's a dangerous place to be out after dark." My pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but I felt trapped. The men around the table were staring at me, their eyes cold, unreadable. Something was very wrong here. I really should go, I said, trying to pull away from the man's grip. Thanks for the offer, but... The woman stood up suddenly, cutting me off. We insist. That's when I saw it. The glint of a knife on the table, half hidden under a dirty rag. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew then that I had walked into something I couldn't talk my way out of. The man behind me squeezed my shoulder harder, and I winced from the pain. The others rose slowly from their chairs, closing in around me. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. There was no phone service, no one else around for miles, and I was completely outnumbered. Look, I don't want any trouble, I said, my voice shaky now. Just tell me how to get back to the road, and I'll be on my way. The woman's smile faded, replaced by something far more sinister. You ain't going nowhere, boy. I moved before I even realized what I was doing, jerking out of the man's grip and bolting for the door. I heard shouts behind me, the scrape of chairs, and the heavy thud of boots on the wooden floor as they chased me. My heart pounded in my chest as I threw the door open and sprinted toward my car. But they were faster. One of the men tackled me from behind, slamming me to the ground. Pain shot through my side as I hit the dirt, gasping for breath. I kicked and struggled, but two of them pinned me down, their hands rough and unforgiving. The woman stood over me now, her face calm, almost bored. We don't like people snooping around here, she said, her voice cold. You made a mistake coming this way. I fought harder, panic surging through me, but they held me down, their hands tightening around my arms and legs. One of them pulled out a length of rope, and I knew what was coming next. Suddenly, the distant rumble of a car engine echoed through the clearing. The group paused, their grip on me loosening slightly as they exchanged wary glances. What's that? One of the men muttered, looking toward the road. Before anyone could react, headlights pierced through the trees, illuminating the clearing. The engine grew louder, and then, out of nowhere, a large truck pulled up, its horn blaring. Who the hell is that? The woman snarled, eyes narrowing as the truck rolled to a stop just a few yards away. The doors flew open, and two men stepped out. They looked like hikers, backpacks, rugged clothes, the works. They glanced at me on the ground, tied up and surrounded by the group, and their faces hardened with realization. What's going on here? One of them demanded, his voice tense. The group around me tensed up, clearly not expecting this interruption. The woman's expression flickered with anger, but she quickly masked it, trying to appear calm. Just a misunderstanding, she said, her voice sugary sweet. Our friend here got lost and we were helping him out. The hiker didn't look convinced. Doesn't look like he's being helped to me. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel the group wavering. They were outnumbered now, and the hikers didn't seem like the kind of people to back down easily. One of the men near me cursed under his breath and reluctantly untied the rope around my wrists. Get out of here, he muttered. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and ran toward the hikers. As I passed the truck, I glanced back at the group standing in the doorway, their eyes filled with cold fury. Let's go, one of the hikers said, nodding toward the road. We'll take you to the nearest town. I nodded, too shaken to speak, and climbed into the truck. As we drove away, I looked back one last time at the farmhouse disappearing into the darkness. I knew I had barely escaped something terrible. I would never forget the faces of the people in that house, and I vowed never to take another detour again. The sun was setting as Ethan drove down the winding back roads of rural West Virginia. He had always loved exploring new places, venturing off the beaten path, but this time it felt different, eerily different. He had planned a quick trip to visit an old high school friend, Mason, who lived in a remote town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. His GPS had stopped working an hour ago, leaving Ethan to rely on his instincts and a paper map he'd grabbed from a gas station earlier. But now, it was clear. He had made a wrong turn somewhere. The road had narrowed significantly, and the dense trees pressed in from both sides, casting long shadows that made it feel like the forest was swallowing him whole. Ethan glanced at his gas gauge. The needle hovered dangerously close to empty. Panic started to creep in, but he tried to stay calm. Just ahead, he spotted a dirt road veering off to the right. There was a weathered sign, half hidden by overgrown weeds, that read, "Elmswood Gas and Supplies, 3 miles." With no other option, Ethan turned onto the bumpy road, which snaked deeper into the woods. Every mile felt longer than the last, and his mind kept drifting to horror stories he'd heard about backwoods communities. Isolated, lawless places where outsiders weren't welcome. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself he was being paranoid. Finally, the trees parted, and he arrived at a clearing. The gas station was a dilapidated structure that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in decades. The pumps were ancient, rusted relics of a bygone era. An old, beat-up pickup truck sat on the side, its windows filthy and the tires flat. Ethan hesitated, but he was out of options. He parked the car and got out. As he approached the station, an old man with grizzled hair and a sunken face stepped out from behind the counter inside, moving slowly as if every bone in his body creaked. His pale eyes fixed on Ethan, and a shiver ran down Ethan's spine. "Need some gas?" the old man rasped, eyeing him suspiciously. "Yeah," Ethan replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm a little lost, trying to get to Copper Ridge." The old man grunted. "You're way off, boy. Copper Ridge is about 40 miles west, and the roads out here ain't too friendly after dark." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Can you at least point me in the right direction after I fill up?" The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he shuffled over to the pump, but as he did, Ethan noticed movement from the corner of his eye. A woman stood at the side of the building, half hidden in the shadows. She was watching him, her dark eyes glinting unnaturally in the fading light. She didn't smile or speak, just stood there, staring. The old man finished pumping the gas and returned to the counter inside the station. But as Ethan handed him a few bills, he noticed something odd. There were no other vehicles, no other signs of life around. The place seemed frozen in time, like a forgotten relic. "You'd better leave quick, son," the old man said under his breath as he handed back the change. "Ain't safe here when night falls." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, the woman from outside appeared in the doorway. She was younger than the old man, but her eyes were hollow, as if life had been drained out of her. "You should stay," she said softly. "It's dangerous out there. Real dangerous." Ethan glanced at her, then back at the old man, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. His gut screamed at him to leave, but he forced a polite smile. "Thanks, but I think I'll get back on the road." As he turned to leave, a loud thud echoed from the back of the station, followed by muffled whispers. Ethan froze. There was something, or someone, else back there. Without waiting to find out, he quickened his pace toward the car, his heart racing. He could feel eyes boring into his back, and the air felt thicker, like the entire clearing was pressing down on him. Ethan climbed into his car, started the engine, and hit the gas. The station quickly disappeared behind him, but as he sped down the road, something in his rearview mirror caught his eye. Figures, several of them, standing at the edge of the trees watching him. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The dirt road seemed longer now, winding endlessly through the forest. The trees loomed closer, and the darkness was swallowing the last remnants of daylight. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he tried to navigate the twists and turns. But after what felt like hours of driving, Ethan realized something horrifying. He was back at the gas station. It was impossible. He had driven straight the entire time, but there it was. The dilapidated building, the rusted pumps, and the same old truck sitting by the side. The woman was still standing there, staring at him, only now she wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the trees, silent and ghost-like. They were all watching, waiting. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized he was trapped. No matter which way he turned, the road always led him back here. He slammed his fist on the steering wheel in frustration and fear. He had no idea what these people wanted or how to escape. Suddenly, the figures began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they stepped closer to the car. The old man stood in front, his expression unreadable. Ethan threw the car into reverse, the tires kicking up dirt as he tried to back away. But the figures kept coming, their footsteps eerily synchronized, their faces expressionless. Ethan's mind raced. Was this some kind of twisted game? A trap he had unknowingly walked into? He had no time to think. As they closed in, he hit the gas pedal hard, speeding down the road once again, his heart racing with desperation. But no matter how far he drove, he knew deep down he would never escape. The road always led back to Elmswood. And as the darkness swallowed his car whole, he understood one terrifying truth. Sometimes, a wrong turn isn't just a mistake. It's a fate you can't escape. It was supposed to be a routine road trip, nothing out of the ordinary. Caleb and Emma were heading back from a weekend hiking trip, cruising down the interstate through the vast desert of Nevada. They'd left late, and by the time they were halfway home, the sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the road ahead blanketed in darkness. Caleb had always loved driving at night. Something about the quiet emptiness of the road calmed him. But that night, the silence felt different. The highway seemed endless, stretching into the void. With Emma dozing off in the passenger seat, Caleb realized they hadn't seen another car for miles. His GPS had lost signal hours ago, and now they were relying on intuition and highway signs to get home. That was when he noticed it, the low fuel light blinking on the dashboard. "Damn it," Caleb muttered under his breath, checking the dashboard again. He had been too focused on the drive to notice the tank running low. They needed gas soon. He slowed the car down, scanning for any signs of a town or gas station. About 10 minutes later, an old battered sign appeared on the side of the road, pointing down a narrow, unmarked exit. It read, "Dry Creek, 5 miles." Emma stirred awake as the car turned off the highway, the sudden change of direction pulling her from sleep. "Where are we?" she asked groggily, rubbing her eyes. "Fuel's low. Saw a sign for a place called Dry Creek. Should be close." The road grew rougher as they continued. The desert, vast and empty, was shrouded in darkness, making it hard to see beyond the faint beams of the headlights. It was too quiet. No sounds of crickets or even the usual hum of wind sweeping across the barren land. Just an unsettling silence. Finally, after a few miles of bumpy, desolate road, the outline of a small town appeared on the horizon. Dry Creek. It was an old, forgotten town that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The buildings were weathered, the windows boarded up, and the streets were completely empty. Not a single light flickered in any of the homes or shops. "This doesn't feel right," Emma whispered, a shiver running down her spine. Caleb nodded but pulled into what appeared to be a gas station at the edge of town. The pump looked old and rusted, barely functional, but it was their only option. He stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin as he approached the pump. He half expected it not to work, but to his relief, the nozzle sputtered to life, slowly filling the tank. As he waited, Caleb scanned the darkened street. There was no movement, no sound, just the eerie stillness of the abandoned town. He could feel eyes on him, though he knew it was impossible. There was no one around, or so it seemed. Emma rolled down her window. "Hurry up, this place is giving me the creeps." "Almost done," Caleb said, glancing back at the town. His gut told him something was off. It felt like they had stumbled into a place time had forgotten. Just as the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full, Caleb heard a faint creak. He turned toward the noise and saw movement in one of the buildings. A shadow flickered past one of the boarded-up windows of a house across the street. "Did you see that?" Caleb asked, heart pounding. Emma sat up straighter. "See what?" Before Caleb could respond, the door of the gas station behind him slowly creaked open. A soft rustling sound emerged from inside. He felt a chill creep up his spine. For a moment he considered going inside to check it out, but something told him that was a terrible idea. "Get in the car," Emma said, her voice trembling. Caleb didn't argue. He quickly replaced the nozzle, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the car. The engine roared to life, but just as he began to pull away, they both saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the street, watching them. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but the figure looked wrong. Its limbs seemed too long, its body slightly hunched, and it just stood there, staring. "What the hell is that?" Emma whispered, fear evident in her voice. "I don't know," Caleb muttered, stepping harder on the gas. As they sped down the narrow road back toward the highway, Emma kept looking over her shoulder. "It's still there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb didn't dare look back. His focus was on getting as far away from that place as possible. But as they drove, something even stranger happened. The road didn't seem to end. It twisted and turned, but no matter how far they went, the town of Dry Creek remained in their rearview mirror, just on the edge of their sight. It was like they were trapped in some kind of loop. "I don't understand," Caleb muttered, panic starting to creep into his voice. "We should have hit the highway by now." Emma gripped his arm. "Just keep going." They drove for what felt like hours, but no matter how fast they went, Dry Creek stayed behind them, never getting farther away. The figure from before seemed to multiply, shadows appearing along the side of the road, all watching, all waiting. Their grotesque shapes lurked just outside the reach of the headlights. "We have to stop!" Emma screamed, unable to hold back her fear anymore. "No!" Caleb shouted, but the car suddenly sputtered, the engine choking before completely dying. He tried the ignition again and again, but the car wouldn't start. "Caleb," Emma whispered, looking around. The shadows were closing in, creeping toward the car from all sides. The air felt heavy, and a strange hum filled their ears, growing louder with each second. Then, from the darkness, came a soft, raspy voice. "You shouldn't have come here." Caleb and Emma whipped around, but no one was there. The voice was all around them, echoing in the night. Slowly, shapes emerged from the shadows, figures twisted and distorted, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Run!" Caleb screamed, grabbing Emma's hand. They bolted from the car, sprinting down the road, but it was no use. No matter how far they ran, the town stayed behind them. The figures followed, silent and relentless. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing onto the dusty road, hearts pounding in their chests. And that's when they realized the horrifying truth. There was no escape. They had taken a wrong turn, and now they were part of Dry Creek, a place where the lost never leave. The air was crisp that Halloween night, as Mark, Emily, Jason, Sarah, and Alyssa wandered through the dimly lit streets of their suburban town. The buzz of alcohol coursed through their veins, and laughter echoed through the empty avenues as they celebrated Halloween like they had every year, with reckless abandon. They had finished trick-or-treating, and now the real fun had begun. Everyone was in costume. Jason was a zombie, Sarah a witch, Emily a vampire, and Alyssa dressed as Harley Quinn. Mark, however, had refused to dress up, saying it was too childish. Now he strutted ahead of the group with a swagger that reeked of beer and arrogance. They wandered deeper into the quieter part of town, where the rows of houses grew darker and the street lamps flickered ominously. A fog had settled over the area, casting long shadows as they moved. "Dude, check this out." Jason pointed toward a lone figure standing at the end of the street. It was a man, tall and broad, dressed in a white mask and dark jumpsuit. His silhouette was unmistakable. "Michael Myers," Sarah laughed, nudging Mark. "You scared?" Mark sneered, his bravado on full display. "That guy? What a loser," he scoffed, his voice slurred. "He's probably some dude trying to scare kids." Emily, who had been trying to enjoy the night without incident, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something about the way the man stood there, motionless, sent a chill down her spine. But Mark, always eager to prove his dominance, was already marching towards the figure. "Mark, don't!" Alyssa called after him, but it was too late. Mark stormed up to the man in the Michael Myers costume and shoved him roughly. "What's your problem, huh? Think you're some kind of horror movie freak?" His voice dripped with venom as he landed another shove, followed by a quick punch to the man's chest. The figure stumbled back but did not react. His mask, blank and expressionless, only seemed to fuel Mark's aggression. He landed another punch, this one harder. "Come on, freak, do something." "Mark, stop!" Emily rushed forward, grabbing his arm and pulling him away. "You're going to get us in trouble." The man in the mask didn't move. He just stood there, staring silently at them. For a moment, the group stood frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the figure merely turned and walked away, vanishing into the fog. "Real tough guy," Mark muttered, wiping his knuckles, though his earlier bravado seemed to have faltered. The group, feeling the tension, decided to call it a night. As they made their way back toward town, An eerie silence settled over them. The festive spirit from earlier had died down, replaced by a creeping unease. A few blocks later, Jason turned to check on Mark, only to find him gone. "Wait, where's Mark?" Jason asked, his voice suddenly tight with fear. Everyone stopped. They scanned the fog-drenched streets, but Mark was nowhere to be seen. "He was right behind us," Sarah said, her voice quivering. "I swear he was." A sense of dread settled over the group as they called out his name, their voices echoing into the night. But there was no answer, just the oppressive silence. Emily's heart raced. "Maybe he just went off to piss or something," she said, trying to sound confident, though she felt a gnawing fear that something more sinister had happened. But as they walked back, hoping to find Mark somewhere nearby, strange things started happening. Alyssa swore she saw a shadow move in the alleyway. Jason heard footsteps behind them, but when he turned, no one was there. The further they walked, the worse the feeling got, like they were being followed, watched. Then, out of nowhere, a loud clang erupted from a nearby construction site. They all jumped, their nerves fraying with each step. The empty streets, usually so familiar, now felt alien, dangerous. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. A figure in a Michael Myers mask stepped out from the darkness, holding something in his hand. It was Mark's phone, smeared with blood. "What the hell?" Jason gasped, backing away. The man didn't speak. He just stood there, the same emotionless mask staring them down. Fear gripped Emily's chest, and without thinking, she bolted. The others followed suit, sprinting down the street, not daring to look back. They ran for blocks, their lungs burning, adrenaline pushing them forward until they reached an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. Panting, they slipped inside, barricading the door behind them. The cold, damp air of the warehouse felt oppressive, and the distant sounds of Halloween festivities felt miles away. I think we lost him," Alyssa whispered, her voice shaking. But just as the words left her lips, the heavy footsteps echoed through the building. "He's here," Emily whispered, her hands trembling. The group scrambled, ducking behind old crates and rusted machinery. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, as if their pursuer was toying with them. Emily could barely breathe, her body shaking with fear. She glanced at the others. Jason looked ready to bolt at any second. Sarah had tears streaming down her face, and Alyssa was clutching her phone in a death grip, trying to call the police. Suddenly, a loud crash reverberated through the warehouse. The figure in the Michael Myers mask had found them. He was inside. Panic surged through them. They scattered in different directions, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the vast, empty space. Emily darted toward a back exit, but it was locked. She felt trapped, like a rat in a maze. She could hear Jason's heavy breathing nearby, and then, a thud, followed by a scream. "Jason!" Emily cried out, but there was no answer. She wanted to run, to find him, but fear rooted her to the spot. The figure moved methodically, stalking each of them with terrifying precision. Emily crouched behind a pile of crates, trying to control her ragged breaths. She peeked out just in time to see Sarah being dragged into the shadows, her screams abruptly cut off. Emily's heart pounded so loudly she feared it would give her away. She glanced around frantically. Where was Alyssa? Where was Jason? Suddenly, a hand grabbed her wrist. She spun around, fists raised, but it was Alyssa, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here," Alyssa whispered. "Now." The two of them crept toward the far side of the warehouse, sticking to the shadows. The footsteps echoed closer, and Emily felt a cold sweat trickle down her spine. Finally, they spotted a small window, just big enough to crawl through. Alyssa went first, hoisting herself up and out. Emily followed, but as she climbed through the window frame, a hand grabbed her ankle. She screamed, kicking out with all her strength. The grip tightened, pulling her back into the warehouse. But then, Alyssa grabbed her arms, pulling her the rest of the way through. Together, they tumbled onto the cold pavement outside. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of a nearby gas station. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they stumbled inside, gasping for air. The attendant gave them a curious look, but said nothing. They huddled together, shaking with fear, as Alyssa dialed the police. Minutes later, the wail of sirens filled the night air. The police searched the warehouse, but there was no sign of the masked figure. Jason and Sarah were missing, and despite a thorough search, they were never found. Emily and Alyssa sat in the back of a police car, their minds racing, their bodies trembling. As they were being driven to the station, Emily's phone buzzed. A text message. It was from Mark's number. "We're not finished yet." Emily's blood ran cold as she stared at the screen. The message was followed by an image. Mark, standing in the same mask in front of a house. Her house. The nightmare wasn't over, and it was coming for her next. Cassie had always loved Halloween. The crisp autumn air, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet, the sight of children in costumes. It was all magical to her. So, when her neighbors, the Thompsons, asked her to house sit for the weekend while they went out of town, she eagerly agreed. Watching over their cozy home and handing out candy seemed like the perfect way to spend her Halloween evening. By 7 p.m., the streets were buzzing with activity. Cassie sat near the front door with a large bowl of candy, greeting trick-or-treaters with a smile. Superheroes, witches, and ghosts streamed up to the house, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. The Thompsons' house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by woods on two sides. It was peaceful during the day, but as night began to fall, the shadows seemed to grow longer, and the house felt a little too isolated for comfort. By 9 p.m., the streets had emptied, and Cassie figured it was time to call it a night. She switched off the porch light, set the bowl of leftover candy aside, and locked the door. She was about to settle in for a movie when a soft knock echoed through the house. Cassie froze, glancing at the clock. It was 9:30 p.m., way too late for trick-or-treaters. Hesitant, she walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. Standing on the porch was a figure dressed in a long black cloak, a white mask covering their face. The mask was simple but unnerving, with empty eyes and a wide, featureless smile. Her heart skipped a beat. "Trick-or-treating is over," she called through the door, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, unmoving. Cassie backed away, feeling her pulse quicken. Something was off. She waited for the figure to leave, but after a few moments, another knock came, louder this time. Her instincts screamed at her to stay inside, but curiosity got the better of her. She opened the door just a crack. "Look, Halloween's over." But the porch was empty. The figure was gone. Cassie blinked, confused. There was no way they could have disappeared that fast. She stepped outside, glancing around, but the street was completely still. A gust of wind rustled the leaves, and she shivered, quickly retreating back inside and locking the door. She settled onto the couch, trying to shake the eerie feeling, but something didn't feel right. There was a faint scratching sound from the window across the room. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned to look. Nothing. Just her reflection staring back at her from the dark glass. But as she stood up to check, she noticed something strange on the porch. A jack-o'-lantern sat there, grinning at her with its jagged, uneven teeth. Cassie hadn't put it there. She hadn't carved a pumpkin at all. Her skin prickled with unease as she crept to the window. She peered outside, but the porch was empty, aside from the mysterious pumpkin. She swallowed hard, backing away, her heart racing. Just a prank, she told herself. Someone messing with her. But when she turned, her blood ran cold. The figure in the cloak was standing just outside the sliding glass door in the kitchen, their mask gleaming in the dim light. They were watching her. Cassie's legs froze, her mind racing. Was this still a joke, or had something more sinister begun? Her phone. She darted across the room to grab it, but as she did, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her. Cassie fumbled with her phone, using its faint glow to guide her. The figure was gone from the sliding door, but now the sound of footsteps echoed from the back of the house. Someone, or something, was inside. She dialed 911 with trembling hands. "Please, I need help," she whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible. "Someone's in the house." "Stay calm," the operator replied. "Officers are on their way. Are you alone?" "Yes," Cassie whispered, tears welling up in her eyes as the footsteps grew louder. She could hear the soft thud of boots on the hardwood floor, moving closer to where she stood. She hung up and crouched low, hiding behind the kitchen island. The footsteps paused just outside the kitchen, and then a door creaked open. Whoever was in the house was searching for her. Cassie held her breath, inching toward the back door. If she could just make it outside, maybe she could hide in the woods until the police arrived. Her heart pounded in her ears as she moved, her shoes barely making a sound on the cold floor. But as she reached the door, she realized her mistake. The door was locked, and the keys were on the kitchen counter, a creak behind her. Cassie spun around, eyes wide, just in time to see the figure standing in the hallway, their mask gleaming in the pale moonlight. Without thinking, she bolted, racing toward the front door. She could hear them behind her, the heavy thud of boots gaining on her. Her hands fumbled with the lock, and just as she yanked the door open, a gloved hand grabbed her shoulder. She screamed, wrenching herself free and sprinting out into the yard. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but it was her only chance. She ran into the trees, branches slashing at her arms and legs as she pushed deeper into the forest. The sound of footsteps followed her, relentless, but she didn't dare look back. Her lungs burned as she sprinted down the narrow path, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the path ended in a small clearing. Cassie stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She was trapped. The figure appeared at the edge of the trees, their masks still expressionless, but somehow more terrifying in the moonlight. They took a step toward her, then another, slowly closing the distance between them. Cassie's mind raced. She needed to do something, anything to stop them. Her eyes darted around the clearing, searching for a weapon, but there was nothing. The figure raised a hand, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, from the direction of the house, sirens blared. Cassie's heart leapt as blue and red lights flashed through the trees. The figure hesitated, their head tilting slightly as if considering their next move. Then, without a word, they turned and disappeared into the shadows of the woods. Cassie collapsed to the ground, her body shaking with relief. She had survived. The police found her minutes later, her clothes torn and her face streaked with tears. They searched the house and the woods but found no sign of the masked figure. No footprints, no evidence of forced entry. It was as if they had never been there. Cassie spent the rest of the night at the police station, giving her statement, but deep down, she knew that whoever, or whatever, had stalked her that night wasn't finished. And as she sat in the cold, sterile room, she couldn't shake the feeling that next Halloween, they would return. It was Halloween night when 5 friends, Alex, Kate, Max, Lisa, and Danny, gathered at the edge of town, standing before the infamous Blackthorn Manor. The house had long been the subject of dark rumors and local legends, said to be cursed after a family mysteriously vanished decades ago. Its towering, crumbling facade loomed over them, cloaked in shadow, with shattered windows that resembled soulless eyes watching their every move. "We really doing this?" Kate asked, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Come on, it's just an old house," Alex scoffed, the self-appointed leader of the group. He adjusted the strap of his backpack filled with drinks and Halloween candy. "We're here to party, not scare ourselves over some dumb ghost stories." Max, the skeptic, chimed in. "Yeah, and if there are ghosts, we'll just invite them for a drink." The others laughed, though a nervous energy crackled in the air. They had heard the tales, strange disappearances, ghostly sightings, and bizarre occurrences that had plagued anyone foolish enough to enter Blackthorn Manor. But tonight, they were determined to prove the legends wrong, or at least have some fun trying. They pushed open the creaking gate, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The front door stood ajar, as if waiting for them. The moment they stepped inside, an oppressive chill settled over the group. The air smelled stale, like mildew and decay, and the only sound was the muffled echo of their footsteps on the wooden floorboards. "This place gives me the creeps," Lisa muttered, glancing around nervously. Her grip on Danny's arm tightened. Danny, always the joker, pulled out his phone and started playing spooky sound effects. "Perfect ambiance, right?" he grinned. They found the grand hall at the center of the house, its ceiling high and ornate, though dust and cobwebs covered everything. A cracked chandelier dangled precariously above them. The group dropped their bags, pulled out drinks, and set up a Bluetooth speaker. Music blared, filling the eerie silence of the manor. For the first hour or so, everything seemed normal. They drank, laughed, and danced, their voices bouncing off the empty walls. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. It started small, a gust of wind that rattled the windows even though there were no open windows or doors. The music would stutter, like someone was messing with the speaker. And then, the door they had come through, the front door, slammed shut on its own. "Did someone close that?" Kate asked, her brow furrowed. "No way," Alex said, shaking his head. "It's probably just the wind." But the unease in the room grew. Max, standing near the hallway that led deeper into the house, caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye, a shadow that moved, even though no one was there. "Hey, did you guys see that?" Max asked, stepping closer to the hall. His voice faltered, the bravado from earlier now gone. "See what?" Lisa asked, nervously looking around. Max pointed to the hallway. "I swear, something just moved down there." Alex, always the skeptic, grabbed a flashlight from his bag. "I'll go check it out. It's probably nothing." Reluctantly, the group followed him down the dark corridor. The air grew colder, and their footsteps echoed ominously. The flashlight beam bounced along the walls, illuminating peeling wallpaper and old family portraits with faces that seemed to follow them as they walked by. At the end of the hall, they reached a heavy wooden door. Alex pushed it open, revealing what looked like a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dusty, forgotten tomes. In the middle of the room was a grand piano, covered in a thick layer of dust. But it was the chair in front of the piano that caught their attention. It was rocking gently, as if someone had just been sitting there. "Okay, now that's weird," Danny admitted, glancing nervously at the others. Before they could react, the piano keys suddenly smashed down, playing a discordant, jarring tune. Everyone jumped back, startled. Lisa gasped, clutching Danny's arm tightly. "Who's there?" Alex called out, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound tough. There was no answer, only the creak of the rocking chair, now eerily still. "We need to get out of here," Kate whispered, panic rising in her voice. But just as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Max rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "Are you kidding me?" Max cursed, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't give. "We're trapped in here." Then they heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, like the distant sound of someone speaking through the walls. It grew louder, more insistent, as if voices were surrounding them. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breaths visible in the cold. "Who's doing this?" Lisa cried out, her eyes wide with terror. Without warning, the door flung open on its own. The group didn't hesitate. They bolted back down the hall, their footsteps frantic. As they ran, shadows danced along the walls, moving faster than the beam of Alex's flashlight could follow. "Where's Danny?" Kate shouted as they reached the grand hall again. They all stopped, turning around to find that Danny was no longer with them. "He was right behind me," Lisa cried, her face pale with fear. "We have to find him." The music from their speaker was still playing, but it had become distorted, eerie, like a slowed-down version of the Halloween soundtrack. Alex shut it off, plunging the house into silence. "We need to leave, now," Max said, his voice trembling. "Danny can take care of himself. We have to go before—" A loud crash interrupted him, followed by a scream. Danny's scream. It came from upstairs. "That's him," Lisa said, starting toward the staircase, but Alex grabbed her arm. "No, wait! We can't just rush up there. What if it's not? What if it's something else?" "We can't leave him!" Lisa cried. But before they could decide, the chandelier above them shook violently, as though an unseen force had grabbed it. It swayed back and forth, the sound of metal screeching echoing through the hall. "Move!" Alex shouted, pulling the others back just as the chandelier crashed to the ground, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Panic set in. They ran toward the front door, but it wouldn't open. No matter how hard they pulled or kicked, the door refused to give. "We're trapped," Kate sobbed, backing away from the door. "We're trapped in this house." The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding them from all sides. Shadows flickered across the walls, moving in unnatural ways, as if the very house itself was alive. "Upstairs!" Alex shouted. "We can try the windows in one of the bedrooms!" Reluctantly, the group ran up the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The upstairs hallway was just as dark and foreboding as the rest of the house. The doors along the corridor were closed, but one stood slightly ajar. Danny's scream had come from that room. "Don't go in there," Max warned, his voice shaky. "Whatever took him is in there." But Lisa, driven by desperation, shoved the door open. Inside, the room was pitch black, save for the faint outline of a figure in the corner. Danny. He was standing still, his back to them, facing the wall. "Danny," Lisa whispered, stepping into the room. There was no response. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. As Lisa approached him, the figure in the corner turned slowly. It was Danny, but his face was contorted in fear, his eyes wide with terror. And behind him, emerging from the shadows, was something else. A dark figure, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Lisa screamed, and the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside with whatever had taken Danny. The others pounded on the door, but it wouldn't open. "Lisa!" Kate cried. "We have to help her!" But it was too late. The screams inside the room abruptly stopped, and the whispers returned, louder and more sinister than before. Alex grabbed Max and Kate. "We need to get out of here, now! This place, it's not letting us leave." They ran down the hall, trying every door and window, but nothing would open. The house seemed to shift around them, the walls closing in, trapping them like prey in a hunter's lair. By the time they reached the grand hall again, only Alex and Kate remained. "This house, it's alive," Kate whispered, her voice filled with dread. "It's playing with us." Just as they reached the front door, it slowly creaked open. But standing in the doorway was a figure, shrouded in darkness, wearing a mask of shadows. "Run!" Alex shouted, pulling Kate with him. But the figure stepped forward, and the house around them seemed to groan in satisfaction, as if it had finally caught its prey. The last thing Kate saw before the darkness consumed them was the faint, twisted smile of the shadowed figure. And then, silence. The legend of Blackthorn Manor had claimed more victims that night, and as the years passed, the stories of the house only grew darker. The friends were never seen again, their fate sealed within the walls of the cursed manor. For Blackthorn Manor was not just haunted, it was hungry, and on Halloween night, it always found a way to feast.